Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Shelter Rock Forum. We welcome you, people of different faith communities, people of secular communities. We're very happy that you've joined us here tonight. My name is Colin Woodhouse. I'm volunteer chair of the Shelter Rock Forum. We're often referred to Shelter Rock Forum of the Unitarian Universalist congregation of Shelter Rock. And we often refer to ourselves as UUCSR or those Shelter Rockers. Okay, you pick whatever you like. But one thing I want to just mention that this is a team effort. The Shelter Rock Forum has been in existence for well over 2 decades. We're going into our 3rd decade. And this is an effort that is a volunteer effort composed of volunteers. And I want to acknowledge our volunteers, and I would like them to either stand up or wave, and you'll see friendly faces, and feel free to go up and talk to them after the presentation. Ask them any questions you like about Shelter Rock or Shelter Rockers and what we're doing here at the Forum. So please engage them. So we have one of our key members who actually brought Robert Jones to our door is Vince Chiametti. Vince, are you here? Hi, Vince. Thank you, Vince. Elaine and Jim Peters, who worked the door and brought all of you in here. That's great. Jim Ansell, where's Jim? Thank you, Jim. Jim has been a former chair of Shelter Rock Forum. Latifah Woodhouse, my wife. Hi, Latifah. I'll see you at night, and I will do the dishes, I promise. Ellen Council, where's Ellen? Okay. And then Bob Nuxel, who's with the Board of Trustees, can't be with us this evening. And Richard Tibbetts. Richard, say hi. Oh, he's out at the table. He took your money, and I think he's counting it now, so thank you very much. And also I want to thank our staff, Jen Seppel, for all the publications that we put out, all the advertisements, all the digital work. We couldn't have gotten you in the door probably without that kind of support. Ben Borton, our membership chair, or sorry, not chair, I'm sorry, membership coordinator. And then we also have our staff liaison, Sharon Esposito. And that's about it, and certainly our ministerial team headed by Senior Minister Ned White. Again, it's all those folks made this happen. The purpose of the Shelter Rock Forum is to provide a platform for well-informed and well-reasoned opinions on issues of importance to us as individuals, as family members, as people who gather in community, as citizens of the United States, and as human beings who share on earth this time and place. It's our goal to sponsor notable speakers who challenge us to reevaluate established cultural norms and to question the source of our assumptions that frame our individual worldview. It is a hope of the Shelter Rock Forum that such awareness will lead to a better understanding of those systematic changes affecting each of us and all those identities I just mentioned. We are honored tonight to welcome Dr. Robert Jones. Robert, we call him Robbie already, who indeed actually fits that mold. He will challenge us and challenge our worldview by sharing his research on how demographic changes in America are impacting religion, politics, and our very identity as Americans. I would like to invite Joan Maneri, Executive Director of the VEACH Granting Program, to formally introduce Dr. Robert Jones. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Colin. We're so grateful to you, Vince, and everyone at Shelter Rock Forum for bringing Dr. Robert P. Jones here to the congregation. Dr. Jones is a leading scholar and commentator on religion, culture, and politics. He's the author of The End of White Christian America, a book that one commentator calls a haunting portrait of America as it was and a window into what it is fast becoming. Anyone hoping to understand how we went from Obama's to Trump's America will benefit from reading this wonderfully written, exceptionally researched book. Robbie has authored 2 other books as well and is a frequent contributor to media outlets that include MSNBC, CNN, NPR, and the New York Times. He writes a regular column on politics and culture for The Atlantic. Robbie serves as the co-chair of the National Steering Committee for the Religion and Politics section at the American Academy of Religion. He's worked with several think tanks and has served as a university professor as well. He holds a PhD in religion from Emory University and an MDiv from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. Dr. Jones is the founding CEO of PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute based in Washington, D.C. Their flagship American Values Survey is the go-to source for reliable data about faith-informed opinion in America. Through the congregation's philanthropy, the VEACH program, which I direct, this congregation has supported Robbie and PRRI since 2015. Under Robbie's leadership, PRRI brings a much-needed database perspective to our understanding of what is happening at the intersection of religion and civic participation in America. PRRI also breaks out for us where UUs are located at this intersection compared to other religious groups. Robbie's research and analysis enables reporters, thought leaders, and public officials to base their analysis and opinions on data about the role of faith and religion rather than on pure speculation. I am so grateful to have PRRI and Robbie as our partner in this work, and it is my great privilege to introduce Dr. Robert Jones.
Well, thank you, Joan, and I do want to say, before I go anywhere, a very deep word of gratitude to the VEACH program, to Carol and the rest of the team for the support for PRI. As many of you may know, collecting data that has scientific rigor to it is a resource-intensive project, and we could not have done much of the research that you'll see tonight without the support of the VEACH program. So thank you very much for that. So I'm going to start with this photo you've been staring at as you've come in. You may not have only looked at it a little bit. I first received this photo in an email in 2012 when President Barack Obama was re-elected for president. And right under the photo it said, Christian Family at Prayer, Pennsylvania, 1942. Now, if you interrogate the photo a little bit, you'll notice a number of things around it. So first, it's kind of got this, it's a black and white photograph. It looks a little bit like the Norman Rockwell's Freedom from Want, portrait, where it's missing the big turkey, with the grandmotherly figure and the big turkey. But there's other things you'll notice about it. Everyone's white in the photo, for one thing. There is a father sitting at the very head of the table, right? So it's a kind of patriarchal scene setting there. And some of you may, at home, I have this antique dining room set that was made in the 1940s. Some of you may have one of these too, right? All of the chairs are alike except for one in our dining room set. And that one on the end is bigger, it's a little bit wider than the rest, and it's the only chair with arms, right? And it's meant to be this kind of chair of authority that the patriarch sat in. So it's a certain kind of, vision of the family that we actually built into our furniture in America. That's kind of the thing that we see here. Now, it was curious that I got this just a few weeks after President Obama was reelected. I got this email from the Christian Coalition of America. If you're not familiar with them, they are a conservative Christian organization that's been around since the 1980s. And I began to read down because I was kind of curious. I was like, okay, what's the thing? And so it was between the re-election of Barack Obama and Thanksgiving. And the narrative under it said this. It said, we are about to celebrate the 400th anniversary of the first Thanksgiving. And God has still not withheld his blessings upon this nation, although we now so richly deserve his condemnation. Let us pray that our Heavenly Father will protect us from those enemies outside and within who want to see America destroyed. Like, that was the text. So, then I knew, okay, I know what this is about now, once I got that. But I saved it immediately, and I hadn't really started working on the book yet. But it occurred to me that this visceral response, right, to the re-election of our first African-American president was about a kind of concern of an end of an era, right, a vision of America that had this, that looked like this photo that you're seeing here. And it was patriarchal, it was white, and it was Christian, right? That was the kind of vision of America. I mean, we even have like a term for it, like WASPy, right? White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. I mean, there was some accuracy to that. And one of the historians that I was using in some of the research kind of summed it up like this. And he said, look, it would not be inaccurate to say in the middle of the 20th century that if you were in charge of something big and important, whether it was government or business, chances are you were white, you were male, you were straight, and you were Protestant, right? Not just Christian, but Protestant in the country. And that is a kind of vision of the country that is kind of fading from the scene. So I'm going to take you through some data that shows you just how much I think things have changed in the country. In particular, if you think about that kind of WASPy vision as the kind of demographic power center of the country and how that's been kind of pushed to the margins here. So I want to make sure I am not misunderstood right on my first foot out the door here that I'm going to use the word white Christian America. I used it in the title of the book. And what I mean by that is really a metaphor. I don't mean the end of all white Christian churches. I certainly don't mean the end of all white Christians. Certainly we have plenty of counter evidence that thesis would be wrong. But what I do mean is by white Christian America is that as a metaphor for this kind of cultural and political power that was built by white Protestants primarily in the country, and then had kind of a lockhold on power in the country really up until our very recent history. So that's what I'm talking about, that has been kind of decentered and that I think is causing a fair amount of the reactions that we're seeing in our politics and our culture today. So my trade is numbers, so I'm going to show you a lot of charts with numbers. I know some of you are very excited about that, and some of you may not be so excited about that. But for those of you who may not be numbers people, you just think of these as kind of vital signs, right, for the country and for different groups that I'm going to put up. And I've tried to kind of be consistent with colors, and so even if you're not paying attention to the numbers, the patterns that you see, I think, are really where the story is. So don't get too bogged down on the numbers, but just kind of tune in to the kind of patterns that you see here. So if I had only one chart to show you, it would be this one. So I've just kind of put up here the Obama presidency and the Trump presidency, just so you can kind of see the eras here. But I'm going to put up two lines. The first one is the percent of white Christians in the country over time. And I didn't go back very far, just 2004 to the present. Now, by white Christian, I mean this: white, non-Hispanic, self-identified Christians, whether they be Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, non-denominational, whatever. If anyone identifies as white, non-Hispanic, and Christian of any kind, this is what proportion of the country they made up in each year here. So you can see if we just go back to Barack Obama's presidency in 2008, when he was first running for president, the country was 54% white and Christian. Like, it would have been accurate to say that demographically speaking, the country was a majority white Christian country. Now, just a few years later, we get to 2016 with the last presidential election, that number had dropped to 43%. It's been dropping about 1.3 percentage points a year over the last decade. That's both because of a decline in the number of white, non-Hispanic Americans, and it's also because of young people, in particular, leaving white Christian churches. And so disaffiliating from those churches. So we're getting this trend because of both of those things. And when I wrote the book, it really just dropped. I was using 2014 data originally in the book. So the decline I was describing was 54 to 47, which was a big deal at the time. As you can see, as we track this on out, even since the original publication of the book, the last numbers we have from this year are 41. All right, so we've dropped all the way down 54 to 41. 13 percentage points over this time. Now, I'm going to put one other number up here that's a kind of cultural bellwether. That is support for same-sex marriage over time. So you can see what happens here. Really interesting. So if we go back, just rewind to 2008 when Barack Obama was running for president, you'll see that only 4 in 10 Americans supported marriage equality in 2008. Barack Obama himself, if you'll remember, did not support, nor the Democratic Party did not support same-sex marriage at that time. During Barack Obama's presidency, that number moves into majority territory, and our latest numbers have that number at nearly 2/3 of Americans today. So it's essentially flipped on its head just in this short amount of time. This is really unusual. We don't really see this in public policy movement. But I just kind of pause with this for just a minute. And what I'm going to set the table a little bit for some things I'm going to say in a little bit. But if you're a white conservative Christian, this is an amazing sea change, right? And it's a kind of alarming sea change. Demographic decline, and an issue on which you were completely, all the chips were in, resisting, flipping on its head in a very, very short amount of time. And I'm going to submit that it's this combination of cultural change and demographic change that has really fueled, I think, some of the visceral reactions we've seen, particularly among white evangelical Christians in the country and other conservative white Christians in the country. So just to kind of unpack this a little further, here's where we are today. The big blue wedge here is, again, the number of white Christians at 42%. Non-white Christians, this is big green wedge, about a quarter of the country. All non-Christian religions make up about 6% of the country. And then the other part of the story is this big orange wedge here. 1/4 of Americans who today claim no religious affiliation whatsoever, right? And that number is also quite new. Just as we go back just to the 1990s, that number was 6 in 1996, right? In the middle of when Bill Clinton was president. And so it's quadrupled since the 1990s here. And you can see one other way of kind of thinking about how much this has changed is to look, before I get to that, one quick thing is that this has also been not confined to one white Christian group, so it's not just white Catholics, it's not just white mainline Protestants like Presbyterians or Episcopalians, it's actually all white subgroups in the country. So what's new here is, there we go, okay. So one way of seeing this, how quickly this has changed, is to look at a generational snapshot of just the generations who are alive today. So you can think of this slide as kind of an archaeological dig down through generational strata, right? So young people on the top, older Americans down on the bottom. If you go down the bottom first, among seniors, age 65 and older, what you see is that nearly 2/3 of that group identifies as white and Christian. But if you kind of come back, and it's linear. I mean, you could take a ruler and draw a line through this, stair-stepping. If you go down to younger people today, though, you can see it's less than 1/4 of younger people who self-identify as white and Christian. So that's, again, an amazing amount of change just over the generations that are alive today. If I put up the other groups here, you can see what the other pieces of this. Again, the big orange difference is the amount in every generation that identifies as unaffiliated. They claim no religious affiliation whatsoever. And again, the remarkable number there is among young people, those under the age of 30, 40% claim no religious affiliation whatsoever. And just so you kind of know how unique this is, even if we take, now it's true that every generation is a little bit less affiliated in their 20s than they are later in life, right? So they have children, they get married, they settle down, they then tend to kind of join congregations at a higher level. But if you take the boomers and you take them back into their 20s, they were only about 12% unaffiliated in their 20s, right? And so this generation is something genuinely new, that we've never seen a generation that's 4 in 10. So even if a proportion of this group comes back and reaffiliates in their 30s as they settle down, we will still be looking at the most unaffiliated generation that we have since we've been tracking modern religious affiliation numbers. There we go. All right, this is that chart I was going to show you, that it's not just one subgroup. Here is white evangelical Protestants. This is actually the newest piece of this puzzle. Up until about 10 years ago, white evangelical Protestants were the exception. We were seeing a lot of decline among Methodists, a lot of decline among Presbyterians, Episcopalians, but not a lot of decline among Baptists, Nazarenes, Assemblies of God, and other evangelical denominations. But over the last decade, we have in fact seen this group go from being almost 1/4 of the country to being only 15% of the country. So that's a pretty steep decline, again, just over the last 10 years, mostly due to younger people who are leaving those denominations and churches. I may need you to just advance this for me if this is, there we go. And here's the white mainline Protestants and white Catholics. So you can basically see the trend lines all look the same, no matter which Christian subgroup that we're looking at. All right, I just may call it advance it. Yeah, so let's go to the next one. And I'm going to go back and forth between this one in just a second, so stay tuned to go back and forth. So here is one of the great things we've been able to do, again with the support from the VEACH program here, is to do data that takes a deep enough dive that we can see all 50 states, not just national level data, not just regional data, but all the way down to the state and even metro level area and some of the larger cities. And so this was a snapshot from 2007. Again, you don't need to pay attention to the absolute numbers here, but the darker bluish colors indicate a higher proportion of white Christians in that state. The green and yellow colors indicate a lower density of white Christians in the state. So you can basically see this kind of U-shape here that goes from the upper Midwest, kind of down around Illinois, and then up the Appalachian Mountains, right up into West Virginia. You can, and then Maine, kind of up at the top, is this kind of higher concentration of white Christian voters. And what's interesting about this phenomenon is that it's not just a coastal or big city phenomenon. This transition of fewer white Christians in the country is actually happening across the country. So if we go to the next slide, here is 2017, right? So kind of go back to 20, just kind of flip back and forth. So that's blue, so you see the less blue, right? So it's about 10 percentage points in most states between these last. So they're following the national trends all the way through. Whether you're talking about Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, all these states in the middle, all of them are seeing very similar shifts. So it's a nationwide phenomenon, not just kind of confined to the coast. Let's go to the next slide. Now, however, here's one interesting thing, and I know everybody's thinking about the midterm elections, so this is really relevant to the midterm elections. One phenomenon we have in the U.S., though, is that the Americans who show up at the ballot box and vote look different than the country as a whole. That's mostly due to overrepresentation and higher rates of turnout by white Christians at the ballot box. They tend to turn out and vote. What that means is that the demographics at the ballot box lag the demographic change in the country by about 10 years, right? So the demographic changes we have today won't really show up at the ballot box until 10 years from now. So that's one of and it's even more accentuated in midterm elections, right, which are lower turnout elections. The last midterm election we had, by the way, was the lowest turnout election we've seen since World War I. Only 36% of eligible voters turned out to vote in the last midterm election. So we'll see, whether this one is different, but we are not going off of a great record. So you can see, however, even though that's true, it's a sort of lag effect, but you can see the same trend. This is just voters from the national exit polls over time. You see the same pattern of lower numbers of white Christian voters as we go out. Click this one more time. You'll see the midterm numbers come in. Basically what you see is that every year the midterm election is kind of a holdover from the last election, and then it drops. Then it's a holdover, and then it drops, right? And that's kind of the pattern that we expect to see going out. At this rate, it'll be 2024 by the time we see less than a majority white Christians at the ballot box, right? So we saw this kind of shift happen really in 2014 or so, and it's about a 10-year lag effect before that becomes a reality at the ballot box at current turnout rates. So that's one of the challenges, I think, of kind of why, and one of the reasons why we're not quite seeing this in voting turnouts as we already are in the population. Okay. One of the other interesting things, and I think alarming things from anyone who cares about a healthy democracy, is the way in which race and religion are sorting the two political parties. Or I may probably say it the other way around. The way the political parties are sorting Americans by race and religion. So if we go back to 2006, this thing on the left, again, don't worry too much about all the small categories. What I've done here is I've color-coded all white Christian groups in blue, right? So some shade of blue you can see. So the Republican Party 10 years ago, about 2006, was about 8 in 10 white and Christian, while the Democratic Party was only about half white and Christian. That was 10 years ago. Fast forward to 2017, the Republican Party has not moved much. It's still about 7 in 10 white and Christian, but the Democratic Party has fallen now to be only 3 in 10 white and Christian, right? So you can see the kind of blues shrinking here on the 2017 side of the ledger. So what that means is that the two political parties are moving further apart in terms of race and religion, with the Republican Party really maintaining itself as really an overwhelmingly majority white Christian party. The Democratic Party is actually changing faster than the country as a whole. It's accommodating itself, and it's becoming kind of the party of everybody else. And so we're really increasingly set up here to have what might turn into a kind of white Christian nationalist party on the one side, and a party on the other side that has less and less room for people who identify as white and Christian. It's kind of a party of everyone else. And so, if you think about the parties harnessing, we already have this kind of, these big machines that sort us every 2 years, right? These kind of political ad machines that sort us. And when they've harnessed themselves also to race and religion, two very visceral kinds of things in, human experience, it's a pretty potent formula for kind of pushing us into political, racial, and religious tribalism, which is, I think, really what we're struggling with right now today. Okay, next one. So before I get to kind of fast forwarding up to where we are today and kind of thinking about what's going on with white Christians in the current context, I do want to put a few pieces up here about UUA members, again, that we've collected with support of the VEACH program, so you can kind of see where UUA Americans are in the grand context of religious Americans. Let's go to the first one. So this first one's got a lot of stuff up here, but basically I tried to put as many religious groups as I could up here. They're typically broken out, looking at political ideology. The light blue one here at 75% liberal is UUA, right? So you can kind of see, left to right, there is no religious group that is more self-identified or liberal as UUA members, right? So even if you look at other groups like Buddhists and Jews, they're only about half self-identify as liberal compared to about 3/4 of UUA members. And all the way over here on the right are Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, white evangelical Protestants, where less than 1 in 8 identify as liberal, and overwhelmingly identify as conservative, about 6 in 10 over there. So let's go to the next one. That's political ideology. Political affiliation looks pretty close. The only thing that happens is that the UUA group gets flipped a little bit by African American Protestants as being more democratic, right? So outpaced a little bit by African American Protestants there, but still 2/3 identify as Democrat, and very, very few identify as Republican, and about 1/3 identify as independent here. But you can see kind of the cycle here. Other than African Americans, those two groups look very, very different. And then over here on the other side, we see about half of Mormons and white evangelical Protestants identifying as Republican. All right, go to the next one. Race and ethnicity. Here we have the blue is white, so Jews and UUA about the same, about 9 in 10 identify as white, non-Hispanic. And you can see that kind of the breakdown across here. The most kind of religiously diverse groups are actually like Buddhists, Jehovah's Witnesses have a very big mix, and other groups are these other groups are heavily white. Next one. And then finally, median age. Here is one that is, I think, again, you saw that decline of all white Christian groups. One thing you'll notice here, I've kind of arranged this in declining median age, is that all of these groups over here on the left, one thing they have in common, they're all heavily white, right? And so kind of a higher median age and being overwhelmingly white kind of go together. And these groups over here on the right are all, who have lower median ages, are all less likely to be majority white groups. And so this has been a phenomenon that we're seeing, and these numbers have been inching up. Really, and it's been really largely because of attrition of younger members in most of these groups that have high percentages of white. So we had white young people that have been leaving religious organizations quite regularly over the last 10 to 20 years in particular. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, so it's probably, we'll get to the red meat here. So what's going on? I think it said something like that in the bulletin. So how do we understand what's happening? How do we get here? All the kind of head-scratching questions from the last election and forward. That was such a surprise, I think, to many of us, not least of all people in my field, were a bit surprised even on election night. One theory I'm going to put forward here is that one of the things that's happened is, or at least one way of understanding what has happened, is to think about what we used to think about as like values voters, right? In 2004, white evangelical Protestants kind of self-identified that way. They ran campaigns around being values voters. There's still a values voters summit that was, I think it's running this weekend actually in Washington, D.C. That's kind of a holdover from the 2000s. I'm going to submit to you that what I think has happened is that values voters have really become what I've been calling nostalgia voters. In this last election cycle forward. That is, they've been less aligned around a particular set of values and trying to kind of find candidates that fit those values, and more around kind of wistfully looking back at a time that seems to be passing from the scene and desperately trying to hold on to what that is. Let's go to the next slide. Some of you may be familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's Stages of Grief. I've actually have found this kind of useful in thinking about what's going on with conservative white Christians in the country today. So I'll kind of recap for those of you who may not have picked up the book in a while. But this is kind of her theory of stages that people go through when they get kind of a terminal prognosis. All right, the first one is they are angry. Right, they're just angry to get the news. Very quickly, sometimes even intermixed with that is denial. Right? Nope, this is not happening. Not going to take it in. Just going to deny it and be angry about it. Those two things, kind of fit together. After that, we get to bargaining. I'm going to argue this is kind of where I think white evangelicals are. They're at this bargaining stage, and in the kind of grief literature, it usually goes like this. Just let me see my daughter graduate. Right? I will then sign up for the soup kitchen. I will volunteer at the church. I will do all this stuff. I just want to, striking this grand bargain with the divine, order of things to kind of stave off the inevitable. I think this is one way of understanding white evangelicals' relationship to Donald Trump. Right? Is striking sort of this grand bargain to kind of hold off the inevitable here. The other stages are kind of depression when you find out the bargain you struck didn't really take. And then finally some kind of resolution of acceptance. I'm not sure I see a lot of signs of that on the horizon quite yet. But let me take you through a couple of numbers that I think will kind of substantiate this theory here. Here's one that we've been tracking white evangelicals' relationship to Trump and support for Trump ever since, really before the election. Interestingly enough, here's kind of the trajectory. Back in the primary season, actually, white evangelicals were split. And they were split between those who went to church a little bit more and those who went to church a little bit less. Those who went more were actually Ted Cruz. Were in Ted Cruz's corner. Those who went a little bit less were in Trump's corner. However, once he became the nominee, all those differences completely disappear. So that even those who attend religious services line up behind Trump, his numbers go way up. At his inauguration, white evangelicals were supporting him kind of over here, somewhere in the 6 and 10 range. And it has continued to go up and has stayed up over the last year and has been above 70% in every poll that we put in the field. Our high point was 75%. The last one we had in the field, just out of the field last week, was 73. It's just been right there the entire time. Doesn't matter what's going on, it stayed just rock steady. And in fact, when we have asked evangelicals who have a favorable view of Trump, if there was anything he could do that would cause them to lose their support, 4 in 10 say there is nothing he could do to lose their support. So that's kind of how locked in they tend to be with the current president. So what's going on right there? What's up with that? It's really clear, really strong. And this is when President Trump's rating in the overall population is somewhere around 4 in 10. So they're 30 percentage points higher than the general population in supporting President Trump. Let's go to the next. One thing that has happened here is that Trump has really transformed white evangelical political ethics. And this is, I think, really relevant actually to our current situation with Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh and the controversy that's going on there. But what we saw in 2011, we asked a question about candidates' character. This is way before Trump's on the scene, right, where we were just asking in general, kind of, what do you think about candidates' character? And we asked the question this way, do you think, or do you agree that an elected official that commits an immoral act in their personal life can still behave ethically in their public life and fulfill their duties in their public life. Now, in 2011, only 30%, that's the second kind of one here, white evangelical Protestants, only 30% of white evangelicals said yes to that question in 2011. That's about what you'd expect from a group that had branded itself as values voters and it kind of pushed off against President Clinton and indiscretions of the Clinton administration and made a big deal about that. That's about what you'd expect. When we asked this question again in the fall of 2016, with Trump at the top of the ticket, white evangelicals, 72% of white evangelicals now say this is possible, right? That someone can commit an immoral act in their private life and still behave ethically and fulfill their duties in their public life. So what's essentially happened is there's been this kind of sea change, and I don't think it's just Trump. I think it really is political partisanship. And Trump happens to be the candidate that has kind of exposed this, but I think it's really political partisanship that has flipped this political ethic from being really a principled ethic where you kind of say, here are our principles, we're going to measure every candidate by it, and we're going to let the chips fall where we may, that kind of an ethic, to really a consequentialist ethic, right, which is a kind of ends justify the means sort of ethic. We know this is the candidate we want, and like whatever the line is from here to there doesn't matter that much as long as we get to point B. And so that's a really quite shocking finding. I mean, you think about the kind of secular, unaffiliated folks over here are actually less likely to agree with that statement now than white evangelical Protestants were. They've not changed that much over the same period of time. Go to the next one. One other thing that to kind of help us understand, I think, what's going on, there was this big debate, and it's still going on. There was a piece in the Times this week about whether it was economic anxiety or cultural anxiety, right, that drove voters to Trump, particularly white working class voters and white evangelical voters. We did a fairly in-depth study with The Atlantic right after the election, looking at white working class voters who overlap with white evangelicals by about half. So if you drew the Venn diagram of white evangelicals and white working class voters, they overlap by about half. So it's a lot of the same people here. But this study was looking at white working class voters, and what we found was very, very clearly that it was cultural issues, fears of immigrants, fears about Muslims, and the sense that the country was changing so fast. So we had a question about that fear of cultural displacement piece. We had a question that asked today, I think the country's changing so much, I feel like a stranger in my own country. If you agree with that statement, very, very likely to support President Trump. So these are probability factors here that are about how much more likely you would be to support President Trump if you have one of these attributes, even when we control for all kinds of other demographic characteristics. So we were controlling for gender and age and region and partisanship and other kinds of things to isolate just the effect of that one sentiment here. So we found, first of all, being Republican, not surprisingly, the most powerful thing, but under that were this kind of fear of cultural displacement, protecting the U.S. from foreign influence, that kind of thing was in that bucket. If you said you wanted to deport all undocumented immigrants, it made you about 3.3 times as likely to support President Trump. If you had an economically fatalistic view, that also pushed you toward Trump. But if you were just experiencing economic hardship without the fatalism, that actually pushed you toward Hillary Clinton. So the economic stuff actually pushed both directions. But all of the kind of cultural anxiety measures pushed toward support for President Trump, and they did so in a much more powerful way than any economic anxiety variables did as well. So that's really the engine, I think, here driving support. It's really less about economic anxiety, much more about anxiety about the country changing in terms of demographics and immigration, and in particular Islam for white evangelical Protestants. Next one. The last couple of slides I'll close with, I think also kind of nail this down about this kind of looking back to some golden age and wanting to rewind the clock back, and what a powerful influence that had. In 2016, we do this survey every fall. We're about to do it again with the Brookings Institution, with E.J. Dionne and Bill Galston that we partner with at the Brookings Institution. And we were sitting around the table ahead of that survey trying to think of it, like what questions should we ask in the 2016 election. And typically what we do is we think, well, what are the most important issues that we're facing, and what are the big debates? And we kind of realize there's not the issues aren't really what this election's about so much, right? It just seemed not to be a big issue debate election. And so we framed a question around whether the 1950s was some golden age that we ought to go back to, right? And so the question literally read this: since the 1950s, do you think American culture and way of life has mostly changed for the better or mostly changed for the worse? If you'll hit the kind of button one time here, and go at one more. And so this one in the middle right here, this kind of hash one, is all Americans. It turns out the country is evenly divided on this question, whether going back to the 1950s is a good thing or a bad thing. Over here on the left, you'll see the groups that are much more likely to say things have changed for the better, right? So it's Democrats, religiously unaffiliated Americans, Hispanic Catholics, African Americans, young people, Hispanics overall, whites with a college degree. Let's go ahead and hit the other side. And all those people who think that things have mostly changed for the worse, you'll see they have some things in common, right? You'll see the word white a lot for white subgroups over there. Whites overall, seniors, mainline Protestants, Catholics, whites with no college degree, Republicans, and go ahead and hit the button one more time, just fill out the rest of the chart. But no group thinks that things have changed for the worse since the 1950s than white evangelical Protestants. Nearly 3/4 of them say things have changed for the worse since the 1950s. So this is kind of my nostalgia voter thing, right? It's more about kind of these fears of demographic change and cultural change, and really wanting to go back. So when I really do think the candidates presented us actually with a fairly decent kind of iconography of our current moment, right? If you remember, so Trump, right, he's got this "Make America Great Again," right? It's that last word that really is doing all the work in his slogan. It's this backward-leaning thing. And if you'll even notice, like even the kind of hat, right, that he put it on, he didn't put it on the kind of slick frat boy baseball cap, right? It's the old feed store tractor, farmer hat that he's with the big ugly foam, high top thing. I mean, that's the hat that he put it very intentionally, right? It's this kind of that's the kind of America that we're kind of looking for. And so that sense. And then what was Hillary Clinton's thing? It was this H with this arrow, right, pointing forward here. And I always get this wrong, which tells you I don't think it's such a great slogan. Stronger together, better together. I can't remember which one. Stronger together, I think it was. But at any rate, it was this forward-looking area. So we really had these two candidates, one saying go back and one saying go forward, right? And I think that was a pretty good encapsulation of what the election was about and where our deepest fault lines are. They're much less about the kind of old, I think, left or right political issue fault lines, and much more about this kind of imagery of who we're going to be as a country. So this is a looking back question, and we decided to do a little experiment and say, well, would this work? Will we see the same kind of divides if we did a looking forward version of this question? So we'll go to the next slide. So that's 1950s. So we decided to ask a question about about 2043. Right, and the thing about 2043 is that that's when the U.S. Census Bureau tells us that the country will become majority non-white for the first time. And so, it moves a little bit every year. It was 2050, now it was 2045, now it's 2043. And so it's sensitive to a number of changes, but somewhere around then is where it's going to be. We put this in a question, and we basically said, look, the U.S. Census Bureau is predicting we'll become majority non-white by 2043. Do you think this will be a mostly positive thing for the country or mostly a negative thing for the country? Go ahead and hit this. It turns out that we see more people saying on one side of the question that this is going to be, one more time so I get the all-Americans in there, this is going to be a good thing for the country. So like 2/3 of Americans saying this is going to be a positive change for the country. Go ahead and hit the one more time. But you'll see the same sorting, right? In terms of like who's more likely, who's less likely here. We only have a couple of groups that are actually willing to go on the record and say, no, we think this will be mostly a bad thing. That's Republicans as a whole and white evangelical Protestants dug in saying we think this will be mostly a bad thing. Go ahead and hit it one more time. Yeah, so there's the rest of the puzzle here. We have half of Republicans versus 43, so plurality saying mostly negative, but a majority among white evangelical Protestants. So let's go to the next slide. I'm just going to put it together so you can see both of these at the same time. Just go ahead and put them both up. So there's the same numbers from the 1950s. There's the numbers looking forward to 2043. Right? So you see exactly the same pattern going down among these groups. And I really do think this sense of, are we going back? Are we going forward? who are we, what do we look like, what does America look like, are really at the core of what we're arguing about, right? It's much less about the old culture war arguments of same-sex marriage and abortion have taken, I think, a back seat to this kind of identity arguments that are, I think, much deeper and much more visceral. Let's hit the last slide. So I'm going to close with this little image, which is a different kind of table image. If you recall back from the very first one, right? So the first one, black and white image, male at the head of the table. This is a still from a Coca-Cola ad. And maybe you may remember, it also ran the same year as that email. It ran at the Super Bowl in 2013, right after Barack Obama was reelected. And it was, the ad was called, I don't know if any of you remember it, it was called, anybody remember? It's called It's Beautiful, right? And it ran America the Beautiful behind this montage of all kinds of different Americans, and America the Beautiful was being sung in a lot of different languages. And this set off kind of a firestorm of debate. They played it during the Super Bowl, and what happened was that on Twitter, like, things just went crazy. There were all these people saying, like, you know, we speak English. There were some people saying we speak American here, but you know, there was this like conservative backlash against this kind of image of what America is. And I'll just close by saying I think this is really where our divides are. You know, if we think about a table, you know, I think what's happened with white Protestants, to kind of broaden the lens a little bit, is the American story in many ways has been the story of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants owning a table that they, when they felt like it, invited other people to come up and take a seat, right? But they still were very clear that they were sitting in the head seat and that, you know, the table was basically theirs. And I think where we are today is we're at a very different place where what's happening is that demographic changes, cultural changes have happened to such an extent that white Anglo-Saxon Protestants are finding themselves no longer the owners of the table. And they're being asked to pull up a chair in equal space with everyone else there, and frankly, having a very difficult time pulling that off. So I'm going to stop there and kind of leave it there, and we'll take some questions.
Hello. Thank you, Robbie. Okay, we have a lot to think about. What I'd like to invite your questions. Feel comfortable to ask your question from the floor. If you would prefer, you can write your question down. We'll gather them and ask for you. After our Q&A, we'll retire over to this room here and for refreshments and a book signing with Robbie. And the last question or last request I have of you is if you would open this and give us some input as to where you heard about us, how was the presentation, what would you like to see more of? And I'm going to throw another question in there. It's not in there. What is your deepest concern about America today? If you can put that in there, we're going to try to bring speakers in that may address your concern, and we'll all try to educate each other. All right, so anybody has a question, feel free to ask, or if you wish, you write down on that card, and we'll gather them. Who's our gatherer? Vince, are you around? You want to gather the questions if anybody has one? Just raise your hand, too, if anybody has a question right now. Yes.
I'm just curious about how you get your information, how you do the surveys. I was saying before, in all the years, I can't remember anyone calling us and asking for any information, any identifying information about how we think and our opinions about politics or our country. And it's funny, I just said that to my husband. Just as we were leaving to come here, someone called with a survey. So, in my experience, we get so many calls that we just hang up because there's so many scammers that are calling and they have agendas. And I just wonder, you must have a very good cross-section that you survey. How do you get people to cooperate? And I mean, how do you get all this information?
Thanks. It's a great question, and it's challenging. You know, the history of polling, right, is that it used to be face-to-face, then it was mail, and then it was telephone when everybody had a landline in their kitchen, and you know they would usually pick up because there was no caller ID. You know, and that was sort of the heyday of polling, of very high participation rates. We have been seeing participation rates drop. I mean, the most killer thing was caller ID. right? Where you don't recognize the number and you just don't answer the number. Said that, so we do. I should say, all of our surveys are random probability samples. It means, in theory, everyone in the country has an equal chance of being called if it's a telephone poll, or being asked to participate if it's an online poll. So on the telephone, it's a random digit dial process that really does just randomly produce digits and gives us a random sample of Americans. It is increasingly challenging to get good samples. We're having to do now about 70% cell phone interviewing and only 30% landline, because every year fewer and fewer people have landlines, for example. So we're chasing that challenge. It's also more expensive to do cell phones because you have to hand dial them because of an arcane law that's still in the books that makes that more expensive. But we're increasingly moving to online panel surveys, and those people are randomly recruited and asked to participate in an online panel. They can't opt in. You have to be recruited in. But I would say if you live in Ohio or swing state or a hotly contested district, you will get much more likely to get calls than if you live in a district that is heavily one-sided. People don't typically poll those. But it's a challenge. We're working hard to kind of keep up to get a representative sample. Yeah.
Hi. The Democrats are predicting a blue wave in response for this year's midterm elections. Do you think that's going to be so? Because your statistics didn't seem to indicate that there was going to be much of a change. And if there is indeed a blue wave, what will be the outcome of that?
Yeah. Well, it's all about turnout, right? Like I said, you know, I guess the opportunity for both sides is that when you have an extremely low turnout election, if you can get your side's groups excited and out there, it can actually make quite a bit of difference. You know, when you have everybody not participating that well. So there's an opportunity here, really on both sides of the aisle. Our latest numbers are showing Dems up by 15, actually, in the generic ballot. Now that's a generic ballot nationwide. Do you plan to vote for the Republican or the Democratic candidate in your district? That's the way the question. And then the polls have been inching up. I think a couple of weeks ago, the average was about 8. It's now inching up more to get to double digits, around 10. Most predictors say that if that generic ballot average stays above 6, that flips the House. So if we're anywhere in the 8 to 10, and we've got 15 in the last poll, that would at least flip the House. The Senate is up for grabs. It's way too many difficult seats for Democrats to grab in this particular election cycle. But it looks likely from the latest numbers that the House will flip. Now, you know, all kinds of things can happen between now and then. One thing I will say, though, is one great hope, I think, was that young people would turn out in this midterm election. We've got the kind of Parkland activists and kind of rallies and marches and all of that, and we are seeing young people active in those things. We are not seeing that translate into voter participation. So our last thing, for example, shows young people, only 40% of young people saying they're absolutely certain to vote, compared to nearly 7 in 10 seniors who say they're absolutely certain to vote. So.
Thank you for your very comprehensive and convincing presentation. What strikes me is what you did not say. And there was no emphasis on economic issues. What strikes me as perhaps the most critical issue in the country is that for most people, wages are stagnating. And it's very difficult for people to have economic security. And that doesn't seem to be an issue.
Yeah, let me go back.
Isn't it?
Can we go back? Oh, do we still have something? Let's go back to that let's see, maybe 3 or 4, I'll tell you when. Be helpful to kind of see it. There, that one. Yeah. So here's the one place where it says something about economic, economic impact. There's now been at least 7 studies that I know of by people across the ideological spectrum that have looked at things about fears about immigrants, fears about cultural change, and put that head to head with economic anxieties. Every single study I've seen shows that it's not that economic anxieties weren't there, they are, but they pale in comparison in power compared to these anxieties about immigrants and Muslims and the other kinds of, that's why I think you heard President Trump talking much more about immigration than you did about factories in Indiana. I mean, he talked about both for sure. And so it's not that it's only one or the other, but if you're looking at relative power of what really tipped the balance in this last election, it was not so much the economic issues as it was these kind of cultural fear issues.
I agree with what you say in your conclusion of having more minorities in this country in 2047. However, since we have a white power structure in control of our government, unless they all drop dead, you know, they say the dying out, I don't see, with the kind of gerrymandering we also have throughout the United States, how we can overcome what they want and get people to have better things economically, etc., because there will be immigrants here and there and everywhere, and I'm grateful for that. But how do we get rid of those in control?
Small question. No, you're right to point to things like, so where we're going to see increasing battles, right, because of the way that the demographic winds are blowing. The battles we'll see, I think, are around voter suppression, gerrymandered districts, and because all of those things stem the tide of this change, right, that's coming in the country. And so I think the game will be, can we slow it down? Can we hold it off another 5 years? Can we make it 2026 instead of 2024 when we hit this tipping point at the ballot box? Well, I think that's where we're going to see a lot of fights, because that really is the shift here. The other thing we had a study last month that looked at experiences of barriers to voting, and you can see it, in the survey. We asked about 4 or 5 different kinds of barriers: long lines, being told you were at the wrong place, being harassed at the ballot box. On all of those measures, African American and Hispanic voters were 3 times as likely as white voters to say they had experienced some of those barriers, even when they tried to get out and vote. And so I think that's going to be a real challenge, I think, for us going forward, because there's a lot of pressure, right, to kind of on really, the pressure is really more on the Republican side of politics, particularly in certain districts, to kind of hold back the change.
Thank you. I also thank you for an excellent presentation. I'd like to go back further than the 50s, though. This country has had waves of immigration of people who were not white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. How did it become a country that was so predominantly that? And how were the waves of immigration then different than the ones that are today?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. It's a really insightful question. I spent a little bit of time with this in the book. So one of the ways that this has happened is that it is worth remembering that if you go back to 1910, Jews were not white, Irish people were not white. Irish people were Celts, Jews were Hebrews. Like, those were the official marks that got checked on immigration forms. Like, they were not Caucasian. And so one of the interesting things that's happened is that the concept of whiteness has been kind of stretched to some extent to kind of admit people that used to be not thought of as white. And also, it's interesting also that the concept of Christian has been stretched. For example, Catholics in 1920. You asked your average Protestant in 1920 whether Catholics were Christian. The answer is probably no, right, to that question. And so that barrier has also been kind of stretched out. But I think we're kind of at the limit point of what can happen there. The other thing to notice is that the U.S. seems to have, our Americans seem to have an allergy that kicks in when the country becomes somewhere around 15% foreign-born. So we were there in the 1920s. That's when we got all this anti-immigrant legislation, the Chinese Exclusion Act, other things kicked in the 1920s to shut down all this immigration that had happened in the late 19th century, heading into the early 20th century, to make it almost entirely European, Western European immigration from the 1920s up until 1965. So in 1965, we reopened with new legislation, reopened immigration. to non-European countries. And guess what? We're back to almost 15% foreign-born. Right? That number got down in the single digits in the middle of the 20th century once we shut down immigration. And it looks like a U across like the 20th century. And so we're now about 15% foreign-born, and I think we're seeing some of these kind of upheavals. Again, it seems to be about kind of a comfort threshold that kind of kicks in.
We associate white evangelicals traditionally with a conservatism sexually and an intolerance of sexuality outside the parameters of marriage. How could the white evangelical population be so tolerant of somebody who is wildly different from the sexual conservatism that they have historically celebrated, and even some would say disgustingly so, as with the Access Hollywood tape?
Yeah, no, it is one of the great paradoxes, I think, of our contemporary political scene. I think the best way that I understand it is this nostalgia voter frame, that there was kind of this shift that happened, and they're not holding him to these kind of principles in the way they held other candidates, and certainly the way they were sort of criticizing Bill Clinton along these same lines. But it's interesting to kind of, so if you go back and you think, well, like, when did white evangelicals become Republicans, is one way to answer this question too. The answer is Reagan, but that's when they sort of flipped. But what's the roots of that? The roots of that was the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And really, once the Democratic Party became the party of civil rights, what you began to see was white Southern evangelicals in particular abandoning that party, and it took about 15 years to get to Reagan before it was before it fully happened. But once you get to Reagan, you have white evangelicals flipping, and from that point on, if you said to me, give me in a sentence, what's the voting pattern of religious Americans, I could accurately sum up every major presidential election since Reagan by saying this: white Christians vote in majorities for Republican candidates, and everybody else vote in majorities for Democratic candidates. That's the voting pattern of the religious landscape from Reagan on. And it is rooted in a kind of racial politics, right? And that's, I think, really important to remember. And those are notes that Trump struck quite well in this last election. It was immigrants, but it was also these kind of racial signals that he was sending during the election. I think both of those things resonated, I think, with evangelicals in a different key. So that I think fears about changing culture, fears about, and I would also say that the 2015 legalization of same-sex marriage, I think most liberals have underestimated what a nuclear event that was for conservative Christians in the country. It was a big, big, earth-shattering deal. And so I think coming off of that, coming off of our first African-American president, coming off the legalization of same-sex marriage, and with this demographic change in the air, I think that all of that overrode these kind of individual character issues at the end of the day.
I noticed there's a camera up there. Hi. Is this going to be available online, this presentation you made, or is that just internally for?
It'll be public access TV. It'll be broadcast for 6 weeks, probably in about a month.
Okay. Is there an online counterpart to that?
We'll see if we can get it on our site.
Okay. Okay. The main question I had was this very important part that you broke down about values voters versus nostalgia. And I was wondering if you could comment about or elaborate on what you said, that nostalgia voters aren't really values voters. It's more emotional. They remember the way things were in the 50s, and it's like a golden era in their memories. Mm-hmm. Anyhow, what's ironic is if you look at economic health of the nation, it was a lot better in the 50s. So that's one thing. But a lot of these conservatives forget, like Eisenhower, compared to today's right-wingers, was like a middle-of-the-road Democrat back in those days, by comparison, and they don't remember that, really. But what I'm saying is the nostalgia voters really are values voters, in my mind, because they're embracing what they remember to be the great values of that era in our nation, the post-war era where the economy was booming. You know, so I don't really see, you know, drawing a line between values voters and nostalgia voters. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, so what I take, I'm actually taking their own branding at face value, right? So if you go to 2004, the Republican Party ran this ivotevalues.com website. An evangelical group focused on the family ran ivotevalues.org. It was like this very like hand in glove like thing. And if you go on that website, it's really all about abortion and same-sex marriage, right? That's what they meant sort of by, it was that and sort of like bringing, you know, it was an anti-Clinton message, bringing honor back to the White House, like that kind of personal character stuff. You had like Bennett writing books on the Book of Virtues, and it was really that candidate character and virtues plus opposing same-sex marriage and abortion, which were tied together under family values, right? That's the way it all got branded. So I'm mostly just trying to take their branding and the way they carved up what they meant by values, right, from the mid-2000s and 1990s, and say, I don't see that, right, in what they're doing now. I think you're right. I mean, it's not to say there aren't values back in that, buried in that 1950s thing, but it's interesting to think about it, right? It is, just to elaborate very shortly, there was a kind of ordered world, right? And if you were sort of white and Protestant, and particularly if you were male, it's a pretty good scene, right? You're at the top of a pyramid, a hierarchical pyramid, right? It's men over women, it's adults over children, it's whites over blacks. I mean, it's a hierarchical, very ordered, everybody knew their place, and everybody knew what their prospects were based on this kind of very ordered world. And I think that's why you hear a lot of things, like you hear people saying, it's all chaos, right? It's, you know, there's no, everything's up for grabs. You know, if you can marry someone of the same gender, I can marry my horse. You know, like it's like a slippery slope. Everything goes into the abyss, right, if we cross this line. Yeah, but I think there is a passing of a world, right, that sort of can go back and hold on to. That again, if you're in a very privileged position, that's a pretty attractive picture, right? But when you find out that the world's been flattened a bit, and you've got, you know, people are talking about gender fluidity and same-sex marriage, and all of those kind of ordered black and white assumptions are messy. So, yeah.
I'd like to ask you about the questions you asked. As an example, one of the questions was, are things better now than they were in the 1950s? I don't know how I'd answer that question. We have same-sex marriage, we had a black president, abortion is legal, we have Me Too, marijuana is becoming legal, but we have less civility, we have more bigotry, we have more mass shootings. So how do you put a value on the question or the answers? And one other thing after you answer that, could you tell me what these numbers mean? I understand what the numbers say, but what does that mean about the country going forward?
Got it. Yeah, so you're absolutely right to kind of point to, I mean, that is exactly what the questioner, what the respondents got, right, is that question. And you're right, it's a little bit of a Rorschach test, right? You could, if you're reading economics into it, you might answer it one way. If you're reading kind of cultural stuff or racial stuff into it, you might answer, if you're a woman, you might answer it one way. But what's interesting about it is that it divided the country right down the middle, and it was highly predictive of 2016 vote choice. So it was really interesting, right? The Democrats and Republicans are mirror images of each other on this question. 2/3 of Republicans say that things have changed for the worse since the 1950s. 2/3 of Democrats say things have changed for the better. The way that we know what it means, you have to kind of dig with some other questions, right? So we did like a look, and it really was, those answers resonated much more with attitudes about race and immigration and those kinds of issues than they did about economic issues. So we can kind of measure it that way. as well. It also is interesting that even when we ask it going forward, we get very similar answers. So you're right that we don't know exactly what was in people's heads as they were answering that question, because it was exactly what was read. But when you look inside the survey and you look at other questions that we asked, it clarifies somewhat what they were actually kind of had in their heads. Because some things correlate with that question, other things don't correlate with that question. The things that correlated were much more things around immigration, cultural change, protecting the world from foreign influence, those kinds of things. And I think what it means for the country is, I think we got to recalibrate the way we think about the two political parties, and I think we got to recalibrate about what we think our fights are over. We still tend to think, I think, in left to right terms, right? And think about issues. Are you left or you're right? But I think things have gotten a little scrambled, right? We've got the Democratic Party being the party of free trade. We've got the Republican Party not caring about Russia. I mean, it's weird out there, right? When you kind of think about historic ways that the two parties should line up. But I think it is much more about how the two political parties are perceiving cultural change in the country, and thinking about the parties through that lens, I think will be. Now, I think the problem is that's a much more intractable separation in the country, right? It's much easier to fight over tax policy than it is over whether we should be a diverse, pluralistic democracy or not. That's a much harder fight.
Hi. Two of the slides. The one about the 1950s, were they better or worse? The 18 to 28-year-olds were above the national norm and saying that it's better now than it was in the 1950s. Then when you did the forward-looking poll, how's it look for 2043, I think it was, the same age group, let's call them millennials for now, were more pessimistic than the national average.
Let's pull the last slide up so we can kind of see it. It's the one where they're combined. Next one. And then hit the, yeah. All right, so let's see.
Optimism.
Right, so they're both at 60%.
Right, this is when you compared it to the 1950s.
Yeah, so they're above, you're right, they're above the national average, right, 60 to 48 on the 1950s question, and they are just under the national average for the demographic change being mostly positive if you look ahead.
No, I'm talking about the slide with the number 1950 on it and the slide with the number 2043 on it.
Yeah, these are the same numbers combined in one chart. So the blue is the 1950s question, and the green is the 2043 question.
Oh, okay, so because of the 48-64, for all Americans, they came out higher than one and lower than the other.
Yeah, so I would say I wouldn't make too much out of the 60 to 64 thing on this question. The margin of error on this survey is about 2.5 percentage points, plus or minus. So it's, it's maybe significant, but it's barely significant. Yeah.
Anybody else? Robbie, it just struck me that we keep using the wave metaphor, like the blue wave and the wave of immigration. And we happen to live on the coast, and it seems like when you look at your map, the coasts are, according to some, infecting the interior of our country. And in a way, it seems like that those more diverse areas are open to immigration, that have a more diverse environment, are liberalizing the country to some degree. What do you think about that?
Well, we'll see. One thing we do see on immigration attitudes is that the historic receiving centers, whether it's the West Coast or the Northeast, so New York, Boston, LA, that have longer histories with immigrants. Today actually have Californians as a whole have actually more positive attitudes toward immigrants. And where we're seeing actually the more negative attitudes toward immigrants are actually in the upper Midwest and the sort of peripheral South, where there's actually not that much experience with immigrants. So it is a kind of, and we also see this kind of interesting thing where if you ask Americans whether immigrants are changing the country as a whole, those people who live in those places where there aren't that many immigrants will say yes, immigrants are changing the country a lot. And when you ask them whether they're changing their own communities, they'll say no, right? But there's this kind of interesting perception piece, I think. But the one pattern we do see, then I want to wait and see if it takes place, that over, places have had a decade or more of living kind of shoulder to shoulder with significant immigrant communities actually have more positive views than those who don't. So.
Great. Thank you very, very much. Let's all retire, have some refreshments. Thank you, Robbie.
Thank you.